Hi everyone, this is Lisa Grace and welcome back to the Teach Middle East podcast. Today we are talking about what a mentally well school should look like. So we are unpacking the characteristics of a mentally well school with my guest, Ava Shabnum Hasan, and she is going to be helping us all understand how we can help our schools here in the Middle East and further afield to become more mentally well.
You are listening to the Teach Middle East podcast, connecting, developing, and empowering educators.
Welcome, Ava.
Hello, Lisa. How are you?
I'm very, very good. It's so lovely to have you.
Likewise.
Please introduce yourself to us.
So I qualified as a teacher in 2001. That was from Hertfordshire University, and then worked in schools in the state sector and the independent sector, both in England and then internationally. So including Harrow International School in Bangkok. It was around 2014, I went back to England after a few years internationally. And then in England, I got into special educational needs. Before that, I had been a more general class teacher in primary. So then got into special educational needs, worked in a special educational needs school for 1 year in London, also other SEN work in schools. And it culminated in becoming a special educational needs coordinator in a school in London. And then I went back to Southeast Asia and did a special educational needs coordinator role in a school there, in an international school. So I was also senior leader in both of those schools. So then I finished working in schools in 2019 to set up mentally well schools, which is the main thing that I now do. And it's a collaboration with a psychotherapist, Daryl Christie, who specializes in adolescent and adult mental health. So we provide programs and CPD training and also quite a lot of free resources for schools to improve both student and staff mental well-being. And I've also just started an associate lecturer role on the Masters in Mental Health and Wellbeing in Education at Buckinghamshire New University.
Sounds like a busy schedule, right?
Yeah, it is quite, yes.
It's quite full on. Now, we here in the Middle East haven't come out of the COVID pandemic, no, but schools are back in session. People are face to face with the students and have been since the latter part of the previous academic year. So we'd say we're kind of in a better position than many countries globally. But before even the pandemic, there's just been such a massive need to understand mental well-being and mental wellness. And we want to start from the very basic. What should a mentally well school look like? But before we even go there, what does a mentally unwell school look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say some of the features of a mentally unwell or unhealthy school would include, so I've got quite a list here. I think in some schools, lip service is paid to things like mental health and well-being, and it's very much treated as a box-ticking exercise. I think you'd probably agree that, most schools' policies and mission statements say the same kinds of things about things like mental health and well-being. But I think the challenges are those actually translated into practice on what's happening on a daily basis in schools on the ground. So that's one thing that would make it into a relatively less healthy, mentally unwell kind of school. A lack of education and training around mental health and well-being. And I think that's for staff, but also equally for students. They need to have that learning in the curriculum about mental health and well-being. And I think, yes, there are PSHE curricula that cover more broadly, like it covers mental health and well-being and a range of other things. But I think more onus needs to be on mental health specifically because it is such a big issue, as you said. And I think just to go back to what I said about training, if there's inadequate training for staff around mental health and well-being, the danger is that we can unwittingly in schools exacerbate mental health issues without realizing it. So by some of our practices and policies and the way we go about things. So I think it's really important for all staff to have that training, not just certain staff. And also just to say, we know that 75% of mental ill health starts in childhood. So early intervention and early support are so key. So this is again why that training is so important. So yeah, if it's a school where that's not happening, that we're not giving staff the tools and the training to be able to spot these things early, support them, and then refer on to other services if needed, then we're doing young people a disservice. And also a school that's relatively mentally unhealthy or unwell is one where insufficient attention is paid to staff mental health and well-being, because it's incredibly important. And you've probably seen the stats as well. I was looking at the international school statistics. So from ISC research, which is from 2021, only 44% of international school teachers, not including leaders, only 44% felt their school was supporting their well-being through the pandemic. So if you have staff that are feeling unsupported, then that's going to translate also to students. And also I would say other factors, unsupportive management, perhaps with a top-down structure or top-down sort of culture of management style. Some management, I still come across it now, who don't see the value in prioritizing mental health and well-being. I'm hearing that feedback from, former colleagues and friends in schools around the world. And some of them are saying, yeah, but my head teacher doesn't think that it's important. So yeah, I'd say that's a mentally unwell or unhealthy school. Yeah, and perhaps one where there's little to no appropriate intervention for students, whether that's a school counsellor. But I also think, as I heard this from a friend of mine actually, so she's teaching now in Southeast Asia. She was saying in her school still that mental health and well-being is seen very much as the remit of the counsellor. The school counsellor will deal with that. So if there's a student who is having some kind of issues of some sort, you send them to the school counsellor, but no one else is involved in supporting them. And so I think that is also another perhaps hallmark of a less healthy school environment.
Yeah, I think you've touched on some really, really key issues. And these are the root causes. And like any kind of illness or disease, how do they manifest in the school body, do you think?
All those kinds of things. I mean, one of them would be probably turnover, probably a higher staff turnover, ultimately, burnout on the part of staff. And in terms of students, I would say the thing is with mental ill health of students, sometimes those signs of mental ill health, the really, really overt signs, may not be seen straight away because they can manifest in other ways. It might be, and so this ties in with what I was saying about staff unwittingly exacerbating mental health issues. So say, for example, if there's a student who's regularly getting aggressive and angry, well, from a psychological point of view, anger is often a secondary emotion that masks more painful and vulnerable underlying emotions. This goes for adults, by the way, as well. So if there is a student who, let's say is seen to be so-called acting out, and if staff haven't had the training, and I think all schools need training in trauma-informed practice, especially in the aftermath of the pandemic, but anyway, I think they do, but even more so now. If you haven't had that training, then you're going to label that student in a certain way, and you're not going to employ those practices that could help mitigate whatever the underlying sort of situation it is that's causing that secondary emotion, that anger, to manifest. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, no, I do get it. So what you're saying in essence is that when it manifests, sometimes it is way down the track. And what we're seeing as a manifestation is after it's gone through several stages. So we might see anger in somebody and interpret it as such when really they've been mentally unwell for a very long time. This is just the second stage of where they are.
It could be that, yeah. And it may not be even that it's been a long time. It could be that, let's say at the moment, let's take the pandemic. Perhaps if there's a child or a young person in a school who is psychologically has been affected by that, perhaps, there's things that, who knows, there's all manner of ways in which it could be affecting us. Perhaps, parents are talking about it. Perhaps their parents are impacted economically, financially, or otherwise. Perhaps relatives died. Sometimes we just don't know all the myriad of ways in which it could be affecting the child. And this goes for staff as well. We don't know how it could be affecting colleagues. So yeah, sometimes even if it hasn't been kind of festering for a long time, Sometimes anger, for example, it's a classic secondary emotion where it's almost easier to just flip to anger rather than sort of psychologically the mind actually engaging with what's beneath that, which might be sadness, fear, anxiety, depression, all manner of other things. So these are just some of the ways in which if that kind of mentally unwell or unhealthy environment, these things can then just get worse and worse, because the way that the danger is that then the way you're going to treat that student is just going to exacerbate the underlying emotions and trauma that they're feeling, and the problematic behaviors are probably going to get worse. Yeah. And their self-esteem is going to plummet. And we also know about the toxic shame cycle. So if they're then told essentially that, you shouldn't be feeling this way, why are you so angry, and shamed for it, that also can exacerbate the sort of psychological trauma.
I get it. I completely get it. I'm now wondering, though, at this stage in the game, when so much has been said about the importance of having mentally safe and well environments for people to work and study in, I'm really wondering, are schools really deliberately still neglecting mental health? What's your opinion on that? Or is it that they just lack the expertise in how to help?
I think it's partly lack of expertise. Sometimes it's partly lack of money. I know that the pandemic has really financially hit a lot of schools very hard. So for them to perhaps spend the money on training staff in all of this, on, sort of perhaps a new curriculum to address some of these issues, it all costs money. So I think there's that as well. And so I think it's a combination of lack of money, lack of expertise, and sometimes a lack of will.
A lack of will. So, because earlier you said that it's sometimes dependent on who's managing and what their characteristics are. And, that will determine how much of a priority mental wellness will be within the schools. What kind of personality traits do you find in the leaders who prioritize mental wellness?
So I know a few. I'm very lucky, actually, that obviously with the work I do get to meet some head teachers who are doing amazing things. In fact, I was messaging one earlier today, and her school won an award in England, actually. So they've implemented policies around reducing teacher workload. So one of the schools, every Friday afternoon is planning time. And I believe that teachers can go home if they want as well. So the children are dismissed early. So this is one of a whole raft of measures that they've brought in. And also reduction in marking. So that sort of marking policy reflects that. All kinds of similar initiatives really around that.
And what kind of leader is that principal? What personality trait do you see there?
Very compassionate, I would say, and having a lot of empathy. I'm thinking of two head teachers in particular who I knew quite well. And just very caring. Also, they're strong leaders and they provide strong leadership, but it's not a top-down approach. So I think they are confident and kind of sure enough within themselves that they're able to listen to different views among their staff and among the community. And it's very much a collaborative approach of listening and then responding. But it's not, I know it all kind of, so, you're going to do this and we're going to do this. It's much more of a collaborative approach. Both of those schools have a lot of training in place for staff around mental health and wellbeing, and also their curriculum has mental health and wellbeing woven into it throughout. So that's what it's doing for students as well.
Okay. Because I think you've answered my question, because I was going to ask you, is it just about reducing the workload? And the reason I asked that, because let me just be honest, and my listeners know me for my honesty. There could be a lazy person's loophole in there if you just go, let's reduce your workload. That will help your mental health. Because the fact is, just because you're a hard worker does not mean that it's affecting your mental health. The fact is, it's about self-awareness, and it's about knowing what your limits are. So that training is very, very important, because what my limit is very much different from somebody else's. I could be working full-time as a principal while running a podcast and also raising two children and I don't end up having a mental breakdown but somebody else adds one more thing to their current full-time position, and it tips them over the edge. So how does mental health training help people to become more self-aware, do you think?
Well, using it as an example, because we have our own staff mental health and wellbeing program that we offer, and we also run CPD training for schools. So what we do as part of that, we educate educators on things like the fact that the body's threat, drive, and soothe system. So these are things which some educators might be aware of already. So, it's educating about the amygdala, about the threat response, about what things in schools can trigger what physiologically.
Dive into that, because I don't want to assume that teachers know this. And if they don't, we love to revise here. We are educators. We love a good revision. So dive into that a little bit further for me.
Okay, I'd love to show you the diagram. Obviously, I can't. But basically, so we have the threat system, which is governed by the amygdala in the brain, which is sometimes referred to as the brain smoke detector. So, for example, things like deadlines, the pandemic, other sort of perceived threats will trigger the amygdala and its threat or stress response. So that's where fight, flight, freeze, or fawn responses come from. They're from triggering the amygdala. And then we have the drive kind of function of the body. And it's the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in that. And the hormone involved is dopamine. So that system is involved in our work, basically accomplishing tasks, productivity, driving us to accomplish tasks at work and elsewhere. And then we have the soothe system, and sort of hormones involved in that include endorphins, oxytocin. So the soothe system is just that. And that's what, when you're doing self-care or, some kind of self-soothing activity, you are engaging with that system, the soothe system. But what happens in schools, this is one of the things we teach on the program in more depth, but what happens in schools, I think often, and I realized this a few years ago, that we often in schools, we're obviously using a lot of drive because there are lots of things to be done, but there's also alongside that a lot of threat. So we're operating at high drive often, and often at high threat levels, and this has been amplified by the pandemic. But obviously things like inspections or accreditations and other deadlines, they will all lead to the threat system being more activated. But what that can lead to ultimately is burnout. And I've got some stats on burnout, which I'll come to in a moment. I was reading up on it yesterday. So if we just carry on like that. Oh, and by the way, towards the end of an 18-year career in schools, I ended up experiencing many, if not all, symptoms of burnout. So this also kind of comes from personal experience and from having known, a former boss of mine who also experienced burnout and left leaving in schools. I know other people who've gone through it and left education as a result. So educating educators on the threat drive and soothe system. So what can we do to interrupt that feedback loop between threat and drive? We need to increase our levels of self-soothing. And I know how hard that can be when you're working in a busy school environment, but it's essential, because otherwise the danger is we're pushing ourselves closer and closer to burnout. I will read you this article I was reading yesterday. It's a study from the University of York, and it's an international global study. And they were exploring burnout in teachers in light of estimates that about over a third of new teachers leave the profession in 5 years. And they wrote, this is a quote, research has shown that while attrition is a problem in most occupations, teachers leave the profession at much higher rates compared to other occupations. This is a global issue, and it's likely that it's only been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Protecting teachers from burnout should be central to international policy aimed at reducing teacher turnover.
Yeah, it's astonishing. I remember one of our earlier podcasts, we spoke to a teacher about their experience with burnout. And to date, it's one of the most listened to episode of the podcast, which tells me a whole lot about why, teachers are leaving. And it's unfortunate. I've worked in education, taught and led for 20 odd years. Don't watch the lack of wrinkles, people. I am not that young for 22 years. And so I know, but I didn't get to burnout, but I got to a stage where I was tired. And that happened after I had my own kids. So I'm not quite sure whether it was the profession or just having to juggle my own family and the profession that really caused me to start feeling exhausted. But what I wanted to dig a little bit deeper with you is we did look at the characteristics of unwell schools. But what are some of the characteristics of a mentally well school? Because that would then help us to gauge our own schools, and the leaders and teachers that are listening to us will go tick, 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 cross. My school has this. Oops, it doesn't have that. What are some of those characteristics?
So I think a culture of genuine recognition that mental health is just as important as physical health, and that developing skills around emotional and mental health and well-being and taking care of those is just as important as any academic skills and knowledge. And so that means, for example, not pushing PSHE or that side of the curriculum. I know what happens. I hear about it, especially from schools in England, but we have member schools around the world. You know, the onus is so much on, say, English and maths and the other sort of academic subjects and catch up and all of that. But the danger is this essential learning just gets pushed off the curriculum and doesn't really happen. So definitely prioritizing those. A genuine culture of compassion for anyone who's experiencing mental ill health or distress, and a recognition that it could happen to any of us, and challenging the stigma, whether that's students who are experiencing mental health, whether it's colleagues who are, so having that kind of culture in place. As I've already said, training and ongoing education for both pupils and staff about mental health and well-being, about regulating emotions, about how the brain and the physiology work, and teaching them so that they learn evidence-based skills and strategies to manage and regulate stress and regulate emotions. And on the training front, I would say, training that I would personally recommend is around trauma-informed practice. There's actually, I was going to mention, there's a 1-hour free training online. Maybe I'll give you details of that afterwards, on adverse childhood experiences and childhood trauma. I would also do training on related issues that can affect mental health. So, for example, racism and anti-racism, because they also have an impact on the well-being of students and staff. And a school where safe and supportive relationships are prioritized, because from a trauma-informed point of view, that's what's most important to help calm the threat response and the amygdala. It's fostering those safe, supportive relationships and fostering kindness and compassion to other people, but also self-compassion is key. So having a school community where you're actively sort of fostering those values. Also, I think I've already touched on it, but a school-wide PSHE curriculum that would cover mental health and well-being, and then more specialized interventions and support within that. And so that sort of links with the programs that we offer, which specialize on mental health and well-being. Of course, having a school counselor in place, and preferably if that school counselor can also be there for staff to talk to if they need to, but also a recognition that some staff may not want to speak to a counsellor in school or via school, so respecting their wishes on that as well, but perhaps having it as an option for those who may want to take advantage of it. I would say also regular opportunities for students to be able to talk about and express their thoughts and feelings around difficult issues that are going on, whether that's climate change, because we know that's massively impacting, there's climate anxiety on the part of a lot of young people, whether that's racism and things like that, whether that's other things that are happening politically in the world, the pandemic, all these kinds of things. So having opportunities within the curriculum for them to be exploring them, whether it's through words, through journaling and writing, whether it's through drama, whether it's through painting, whatever it might be, but having these ways to express emotions, and because that will all help process challenging thoughts and emotions. And a supportive approach to parents as well, helping also to educate parents on all of this, everything that we've been talking about, so that they can better support their children, and so that they can also better support the school, so that everyone's kind of on the same page about what needs to be done and why. Because I get that sometimes, perhaps this is especially true of some of the schools in the Middle East that you work with, and I've worked in international schools where there's a lot of pressure sometimes from parents and parental expectations that, okay, we want our child to catch up now. We've been in this pandemic for a while, and perhaps there isn't an appreciation of why piling on the pressure academically right now perhaps is not the best idea. So educating parents too and helping them support their children and support the school and support staff.
Yeah. No. You've said quite a bit there, and I hope that our listeners have maybe identified things in their schools that are going well and things that could potentially be improved. But we talked earlier about teacher burnout, and it's such an issue in schools that are not mentally well. You see it in the churn rate with staff. I wonder, though, what teachers should look out for in their own lives. How do they identify, oh my God, I think I'm at the point of burnout, or is it something else? What are they looking at? What are some of the symptoms or characteristics of burnout?
So some of the characteristics are, really not wanting to go to work and feeling anxiety about going to work. Also insomnia, the chronic insomnia. And we actually have an infographic about it. I wish I had it here right now, but it mentions all the different signs. Also digestive issues. It can affect us sort of various physical bodily functions as well, including digestive issues. So it may be that we're eating more than we normally would. It may be that we're not eating as much as we normally would. There may be other kind of digestive issues as well, perhaps. And just also a feeling of just feeling very jaded and cynical about the job or about aspects of the job, and also not wanting to socialize or not wanting to socialize anywhere near as one used to, and just feeling exhausted, fatigue nearly all the time. So those are some of the main signs, and various manifestations of anxiety and stress, both sort of physical and so, it might be, none of these are in all cases, but things like panic attacks, or feeling very anxious in various situations in school, but essentially not wanting to go in and not being perhaps as productive as one would normally be or as one was before.
What was your personal experience with burnout? You mentioned that earlier. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, I can a bit. So with hindsight, because it was towards the end of an 18-year career in schools, with the benefit of hindsight, I was probably already showing a few signs of burnout before this. But, you kind of soldier on and you think, I can do this. And I saw the value in what I was doing. I was a SENDCo and a senior leader. And I certainly with my SENDCo role, I felt very, very passionate about supporting children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities. So, and I knew I was doing a very good job. That was the feedback I got. But then what happened, I actually suffered a bereavement. So this was it's coming up to 3 years ago now. So I suffered a bereavement. And in the aftermath of that, I was not in a good place. So I was still going into school and doing the job to the best of my ability. But I think that, I know really that the bereavement was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for me, because I was then grieving. And then on top of, because I'd been working out, the hours I'd been working were like, I don't know, you wake up at say 6 a.m. or whatever, you're at school by 7. Then I was working, even when I got home, let's say if I got home at 6 p.m., I was still working for 2 or 3 hours every evening. Then every weekend, I was having to work pretty much one full day every weekend. I had too much to do. And I'm an efficient worker. And I've been in roles before. I think this is the issue for quite a lot of school staff. There is physically too much to do sometimes. It's not a matter of, okay, you need to manage your time better or something like that. There was too much to do. And I'd had a conversation with my line manager to say, there is too much to do. This was prior to the bereavement. And we were told that, there would be this survey that we could all do, the staff wellbeing survey would be coming up soon, and that then things would be put in place. So anyway, I'd already flagged it up to my sort of line manager. But then after the bereavement, basically, to cut a long story short, I didn't receive support for my own wellbeing in the aftermath of that bereavement. And in fact, what I got was the opposite of support, without going into too many details. But it was a hugely unsupportive response. And I ended up having to say, for example, look, there's no timeline for grief. I'm still coming into school. I'm doing the job to the best of my ability. It's going to take me time to get over this. But basically, I was told, how come you're not over it by now? And this was 6 or 7 weeks after the bereavement. So after that conversation, there was more to that conversation than that. Things were said to me, which I thought clearly showed a lack of understanding of mental health and well-being. So my own well-being then suffered even more as a result. And I think that's what culminated in the burnout. So I then ended up having my first and only panic attack. Glad to say I haven't had one since. A few weeks after that, the insomnia got incredibly bad. So I ended up on sleeping pills prescribed by a doctor. It just high anxiety. So I was already not in a good place because of the death of my friend. It was a friend. She was a peer who had also been a teacher. She died an untimely death. So yeah, it's very hard.
Yeah. I find that sometimes schools can be horrifically uncaring places. It's weird because obviously it's supposed to be teaching young people how to be whole citizens who are empathetic and who will grow up to be kind and caring adults, right? But schools within themselves and between the staff can be quite uncaring. And I'll tell you why. I remember within a previous school that I worked at, there was one teacher who had a real problem, a mental issue. Like she really had issues and it manifested in all sorts of ways. And she ended up one day, I think she came into school drunk. It was just really bad. And having spoken to her, I knew she was having problems sleeping. And I think she ended up drinking a little bit too much so that she could pass out, so she could end up coming in. But then when she came in, she had a hangover. It was just a whole palaver. But anyway, what happened was that head teacher was just cutthroat. If you can't do this job, if you were not meant to be a teacher, you should literally walk away, explore your options. There is no place here for. And to be honest, she was a really good art teacher. She was an art teacher. She was such a good art teacher, creative, just really, you know, those teachers who are like out there thinkers who could get the kids to do some really creative work. She was that type of person. Okay. But, you know, she had her mental issues. And that was earlier in my career. I saw no support for her. Like they literally said, you're dead weight. And if you can't manage yourself, we can't manage you off. You know, you need to find somewhere else to go. That is essentially paraphrasing their words to her, but that's essentially what they were saying. So I'm hoping, and this was, I want to say 17 years ago when I think back, and I hope really that schools have changed. But let me ask you, do you think schools have changed?
Well, that incident that happened to me was only less than 3 years ago. And then at the same time, someone who she had been my line manager at a different school, an international school. And she, by this point, was a principal of, I think, the lower or middle school of another international school. I won't give any identifying details, but she was going through a similar thing. So she was basically being bullied by her head of school, overall head of school, at the same time as I was going through what I was going through. So I would say it's still happening. Unfortunately, I hope that there's more awareness about it now. And in fact, we're going to be doing a post, I think next week, about toxic work environments, because I don't think it gets talked about enough within education. And I think the fact is it does happen sometimes. And just as it does in all workplaces. But I think it's especially sad because, as you say, really, as educators, we're supposed to be role models. And if we can't model being compassionate towards our colleagues, then what hope do we really have of teaching the children? Because I think on some level, children can see through it if you're not entirely authentic in, you know, you're telling them one thing, but you're doing another.
Yeah. I mean, children will tell you, though. They'll say you're a hypocrite because you're not doing that. But you know what I find is heartening? I find head teachers who are bullies heartbreaking. I can't say any other way. I find it heartbreaking. And the reason is we are meant to be stamping out bullying as head teachers. We're meant to be making sure that our schools are bully-free zones. But we're the bullies? Like, how do you even wrap your head around that? It's very, very sad.
It's very sad. And I have sort of theories on it. I don't know how correct I am, but, I talk to some of my friends who are still teachers. And, like one of my friends, for example, she wonders if, some of the people who are working internationally, perhaps they've been working internationally for a long time. So let's say primarily because I'm British, let's say they left the UK, I don't know, a couple of decades ago or maybe longer. But perhaps they have a certain mindset that isn't very up to date, say, with current thinking in education, and not just in education. Just so they've got maybe still quite an archaic mindset. That's not to say people can't sometimes get up to speed with current thinking, but sometimes I think perhaps this is where I come back to, maybe there isn't a will to really affect meaningful change because they're quite happy with the status quo.
Yeah, you're right. I think it has to be a lack of will, because it certainly is not a lack of knowledge or access to knowledge, because the world is such that if you want to know, you can know. There is no secret knowledge hidden anywhere under any rock for anybody to unearth. You definitely should be able to know and find out. A school wants to know, where do you direct them? What programs? And we don't want to only do paid programs. We want to talk about resources in general.
Sure.
What resources would you direct them to?
So I mentioned earlier, this is not one of ours, so this isn't a blatant plug, but about trauma-informed practice. So we do offer, and we're not the only ones, but we offer training on CPD training on trauma-informed practice, but also for schools, especially if they don't have the budget, but also all staff can do this online 1-hour training. It's called ACEs, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences. I'll send it to you. So it's acesonlinelearning.com. So it's actually a joint effort between Public Health England and Bernardo's charity and a few others. But it's not perfect, but it's a good introduction to the potential effects of childhood adversity and trauma on children and young people and adults. So it's not just for schools, it's for anyone sort of in society at large, but it's a good introduction to some of what I've been talking about, and that's free online, so anyone can access it anywhere in the world. Also, we have free resources on our website. We add to them regularly. So we've got packs, like a teacher wellbeing resource pack. We've got, someone just downloaded today, the sleep, exercise and diet. That's for students. A stress awareness pack, and that's got resources for students and staff. So we've got quite a lot of free resources, most of which are taken from the paid programs.
And we can learn more from your website. And what's your website then?
Okay, it's mentallywellschools.co.uk.
Okay. And in terms of your outlook, right? So we're going into our final thoughts of this podcast, but in terms of your outlook, where do you see us going in terms of developing more mentally well schools? Do you have hope? What hope do you have?
I do have hope. I have to keep my hope alive, because at times, and I'm coming more from a UK angle, and I'm very aware of what's going on in the UK right now, and I don't feel it's a particularly rosy picture in terms of mental health and well-being there. But I hope that if there's, and I'm just one person, but there are many more people working in a similar field of, education and sort of mental health, who are all saying very similar things, that we need to be raising the profile of mental health and well-being across the board. So I hope that message will get through to more and more school leaders and organizations, and that things will change for the better for our children and young people, because at the moment the stats are really shocking. I don't know about globally, but I know that globally it's a similar picture, but in the UK in 2017, 1 in 9 children and young people had a mental health disorder, in the words of the NHS, or a likely mental health disorder. Now it's 1 in 6. So the trajectory even pre-pandemic was not good. And the Secretary General of the United Nations actually said a few months ago that it's a similar picture globally. So we need to be raising the profile of these things. I think we need to keep talking about them. And I think what we need is school leaders who are open to taking on new ideas and innovative thinking, because we're dealing with a whole set of new circumstances that we didn't have when we were at school now, with things like climate change and the rise of technology, which social media has, some really quite negative effects on mental health and well-being, and also the rise of AI, so that the job market is going to be more and more unrecognizable for our children and young people because many things are going to be automated. So, for all these reasons, I think we need to look at how can we, to some extent, reform education so that it's more conducive to the mental well-being of children and young people and staff.
Yeah, I do agree with you. I think I want my final thoughts to be one of hope. And I do also think the fact that you, Ava, and myself are having this conversation is a sign of hope. You and I, total strangers yesterday, have sat and talked about this issue today, which means that more conversations can be had. And I genuinely believe that the more we talk about this and the more we spread awareness, there can be solutions to this problem. We might not be able to solve it, just you and I, but our voices added to other voices will form a chorus, and then that will also form a massive sea change. So here's to us adding our voices to developing and nurturing mentally well schools. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Teach Middle East podcast. Visit our website, teachmiddleeast.com, and follow us on social media. The links are in the show notes.